everybody and welcome to how to build Norscan army compositions. This video will teach you how to make army compositions while playing Norsca at every stage of the game. But first, let's go over the overall army strengths and weaknesses. First of all, the strengths. They have quite a versatile roster with a good mix of monsters and monster hunting men, meaning they can adapt quite well to whatever they're fighting. Speaking of which, they also have a ton of highly damaging monsters once they get to the late game, and also tend to get very tanky later on into the campaign. As weaknesses, however, they only have the one lord choice, which is Cringe, and he's a basic fighting lord, so that's Cringe times 2. They also are quite weak to range with not a lot of it themselves, meaning if they start far from the enemy, they will take some hits on the way to meet them. They're also quite squishy in the early game with a lot of half-naked men with sharp sticks, rather than any actual armor. Right, now let's get into the early game composition. For this we have access to tier 0 units. These are the Marauder Chieftains, Marauders and Marauder Spearmen, and tier 1 units, which are Marauder Hunter Javelins, Marauder Horsemen, and Norscan Warhounds. My early game composition, I'm of course leaning it with a Marauder Chieftain since I have literally no choice, so kinda have to go with them. To start off with, they are just basic frontlines fighters, but eventually they'll get on some better mounts and have more abilities to assist your front lines. They won't be the best in duels, but versus anything equal to or lesser than them, they should do just fine. For the front lines, we're going with 2 Marauder Spearmen and 5 Marauders. We're going to get some anti-large damage and charge resistance online to protect the flanks of your front lines, which is never a bad thing with those spears. They also have decent defense despite their less than armored appearance, so should keep your backline safe and sound long enough to get them to do some good damage. The Marauders are your basic frontlines units for the Norscans. They are more focused on offense than defense, as is the Norscan way. So try to deal as much damage as you can and speedrun taking out the enemy to avoid having taken too much damage. But if they do, they're nice and cheap, so it's not too bad. For the ranged infantry, we're going with 6 Marauder Javelins. We have plenty of range damage right out the gate. These lads are specialists in taking out large targets, so if you can find one for them, then all the better. But if not, they will do decently against enemy front lines. They don't have the best firing arc, so if you can get them an angle, it's probably worth it for the added shots they will be able to safely get off. We're going to go with 2 Marauder Horsemen. These are even more ranged units, but these guys will be trying to get around the backs of the enemy and firing into them as much as possible. Their flanking damage will sap the leadership of enemies constantly, so make the job of your front lines even easier. Just don't let them get caught in melee, as it is really not good at all. Closes out, we have 4 Norscan Warhounds. Finally something to take out the enemy ranged units. Send them in 2-on-1 to make sure they can take out the unit and burst it down as quickly as possible. Keep them on retreating units to watch them melt, as nothing does it better. And do not let them get bogged down into any actual fights, otherwise they will quickly fall. The strengths of this composition, good damage in every category, so no matter what you come up against, you should be just fine. The flanking capability is also super useful for taking out ranged and make the job of your front lines way easier. They also have decent mobility on the whole, with a relatively speedy army to go with the dogs and horses. As for the weaknesses, we have no magic to start off with, so you're missing a major component of battles for a little while. It's also not the most armor piercing damage in the world, so if you happen to come across anything super tanky, it's going to take a very long time for them to go down. And also, it's not the toughest army, with the underdressed Norscans not having these super high armor stats that you see in some other factions. Coming to the mid-game now, we have access to tier 2 units. These are Marauder Berserkers, Marauder Great Weapons, Marauder Hunters, Marauder Horsemen Throne Axes, and Marauder Chariots, as well as tier 3 units, Marauder Champions, Marauder Champion Great Weapons, Marauder Horsemasters, Marauder Ice Wolf Chariots, Skin Wolves, Norscan Ice Wolves, Skin Wolf Werekin, Norscan Trolls, Norscan Ice Trolls, and Shaman Sorcerers of Death, Metal, and Fire. My mid-game composition, of course, still being led by that Marauder Chieftain, still going to be pretty much the same. If you want, you can grab an early amount, but for me, we're waiting for that Mammoth in the late game and spending my skill points elsewhere to help the rest of the army. For the front lines, we're now going with 6 Marauder Champions with Great Weapons. These are top-of-the-line front lines units with much improved armor and armor-piercing damage. Yes, they don't have the most defense in the world, but in the mid-game, the armor should allow them to take enough hits to allow your army to take down most enemies. For our ranged units, we're going with 5 Marauder Horsemen Throne Axes, upgrading to Throne Axes for that armor-piercing damage. You want to use them pretty much the same as you did the other ones, now you just have more of them, so get all the way around the backs of the enemies and fire into them and do a ton of damage. We're going to go with 4 Ice Trolls here to provide a bit more damage on the front lines with their large area of effect and highly damaging attacks. They do deal great damage, of course, but they aren't the toughest thing, so make sure to take them out once they start to feel the heat and let their regen kick in before sending them back. And finally, closing us out, we have 4 Skin Wolves. These guns function as replacements for the Warhounds. They still have great speed, but now come with a ton of damage and will rip anything apart that isn't too tough in seconds. Have them flank the enemy front lines and chase down their ranged units. They won't be as effective at taking out retreating units, but their burst will be way better. Just make sure they don't get pinned down, otherwise they will go down extremely quickly. The strengths of this army composition, a ton of armor-piercing damage from pretty much every single unit. We also have a good bit of mobility and flanking potential with the Skin Wolves. It's also a very strong front line that should beat most enemies without ranged interference. As for the weaknesses, however, it's not the toughest army in the world, since everything aside from the Lord and Champions doesn't have a ton of armor. There's also no magical presence. You could have got a shaman here, but I'm biding my time for the Fimir in the late game to save myself from having the shaman sat around later on. You also don't have much ranged firepower, so the enemy can kite you can't really do much about it. And finally we come to the late game. For this we have access to tier 4 units. These armoured skinwolves, feral manticores, Fimir warriors, Fimir Balefiends of Fire and Shadows, feral mammoths and war mammoths, and tier 5 units. Great weapons Fimir warriors, frostworms, Norscan giants, and war mammoth war shrines. My late game composition, of course, still being led by that Marauder Chieftain, should finally be on the Mammoth Mount for a huge power spike. We are forced to be reckoned with on the front lines, with massive area attacks taking out units with ease. This does, however, making him into a bit of a huge range target, so try to keep him safe, otherwise he will not last long. Finally, going to pick up some magical value in the form of the Fimir Balefiend of Fire. These are brilliant casters, as well as decent fighters. Of course, going with the Law of Fire, because it's the best law. Now they can do well on the front lines as well as supporting with spells, so get them involved in fighting quite centrally, so they can cast wherever is needed. Keeping the same front lines as before in the form of 6 Marauder champions with great weapons, and we're now going to go with 4 Fimir warriors with great weapons to assist them in those front lines. Great weapons have the same damage as regular Fimir warriors, but also have a good chunk of anti-large bonus damage without any major downsides. They still do great front lines damage if that's what's needed, but if you can find them a large tag to focus on, they will really shine and do a ton of damage. Upgrading our skinwolves to armoured skinwolves, because they are leagues tougher, and despite the speed loss, this is totally worth it to keep them alive in whatever they're doing. You're going to use them the same and just be a little bit more careful with their pathing to make sure they don't get caught out. They'll still shred backlines, and if they are needed or run out of things to kill, can do great work on the backs of the front lines as well. We can go with 2 war mammoths because, of course we are, they have a ton of arm-piercing damage and huge area of effect attacks, alongside the constant ranged fire from their backs, making them into walking fortresses with tons of HP and a massive damage output. The only downside of these lads is the size, as they are nearly impossible to miss and can be taken out by peasant archers, so take out enemy ranged and let these boys run wild. Finally closing us out, we have 2 frostworms for some air superiority. They will be used to assist with the dismantling of the backlines, alongside those breath abilities being used to take out any big blobs the enemy comes up with. Since they are so fast and do so much damage, they can get anywhere and do anything you need them to, so don't be afraid to send them against all sorts to see what they can do. The strengths of this composition, we now have a ton of monstrous power, which is finally online. We also have a massive damage output from pretty much everything on the roster, as well as being a pretty tough army, with most units having a ton of health and a good bit of armour. The weaknesses, however, this is quite a small army with a lot of smaller unit sizes and single entities, so it's quite easy to get outnumbered and surrounded. Magic support also isn't the most mobile thing in the world, so if you need some help on the other side of the map, it could be a little challenging for your caster to get over there. Also, the large amount of monsters do mean you are a huge ranged target, so a strong ranged focused enemy could take you out before you even make a move. Now to close you out and to see how this army composition performs in battle, I'll pass you over to live commentary Miles. Take it away. Thank you very much for that, Miles. As you can see, everybody, of course, we're going against the Empire. And of course, they have a bunch of ranged units, which is actually not the best matchup for us, but is going to let me show you just how you can overcome the odds. So they have a bunch of gunners, I believe they have a couple of archers, of course, a bunch of great swords, 2 Hellstorm rocket batteries, and I believe they have 2 Lumnax of High, or just the one. There's one there. And yes, they've got another one there. So initially, I'm moving my dragon around to avoid getting caught out by this Empire Captain and shot to pieces. I don't really care about the Empire Captain, but getting shot to pieces by his entire army while fighting him would be suboptimal, as they say in the industry. Of course, my front lines, everything down here is just moving up as quickly as they possibly can. I'm actually moving the monsters a little bit slower than the infantry, purely just to keep the monsters safe. If the infantry takes some hits, I don't really care too much, but if I start to lose a bunch of Fimir warriors or a mammoth, I'm going to be pretty upset about that. On the right hand side over here, we have the armoured skinwolves moving around. Of course, only 56 speed, so they're not the fastest units in the world, but nevertheless, they will easily outpace any infantry, which is the only thing that's over here. Most of the cavalry is actually designed to engage on the front lines, which is really good for me. These guys have a ton of armour, and once the Fimir great weapons get in there, they'll be able to absolutely shred them with their anti-large damage. As you can see, they're about to make impact now. A few volleys of Hellstorm rocket batteries have also come, and again, focusing my front lines because it's exactly what I want them to do. I've absorbed a couple of charges, and now we see that the Empire Captain is about to charge into my armoured skinwolves, but he's only going to be able to take on 1 unit, so the other 3 will loop around and continue to make flanks on the enemy, so no problem at all whatsoever there. Got cast off by my Fimir Balefiend of Fire onto those Gundam and Surefires, and it should clip those handgunners and maybe get the White Wolves, Huntsmen, just all these range units over here. The Burning Head, what a brilliant spell, the Law of Fire. God, I do love it so much. Now, the General of the Empire has also decided to engage with, what is that? That looks to be Marauder Champion Great Weapons. So I'm going to move in my Balefiend and the Fimir Great Weapons warriors, which is it's certainly a mouthful, I must say, in to fight him as quickly as possible, along with my Marauder Chieftain, who he seems to be making a bit of a beeline for. He flies back into there, causes these guys to disengage. When he comes back in, I'll be sure to retarget them all onto him. I'm peeling off this mammoth to take care, because there is 2 units of great swords coming over here to attack these skinwolves. While the skinwolves, you know, they're doing alright versus the Empire Captain, I would probably prefer them not to get swamped by a bunch of units of great swords, which is why I'm now sending in my Frostworm to take them out. Now, my other Frostworm is now moving in to take on the Hellstorm rocket batteries, but single entities like this kind of struggle taking on the Hellstorm rocket batteries, because they've got many different pieces. If this was Final Luminac of Heish, much better. In fact, that's probably what I should have sent him to attack, but the Hellstorms give me more trouble, so I decided to take them out much quicker. As you can see, I'm easily beating their lot. This battle happens very quickly, by the way, so I apologize for my very rapid speaking. I hope I don't trip over myself too many times. Now, we have had a breakage in the right-hand side of the front lines over here, which is some Marauder great weapons versus some great swords. Honestly, not that worried about it. As I said, if anything's going down the army, I prefer it to be these guys, since they are pretty much the cheapest and also the squishiest things. We have some Famir great weapons with anti-large damage fighting against Luminac of Heish, which is, of course, a large target, so they thing is definitely going to feel the burn. We finally are getting my Skinwolves into action. We have 2 units going for the Hellstorms and then 1 unit going for these Gundamans, Surefires. I also have this other unit of Marauder Champions, which I actually did send in over here, but they've decided to just kind of give up, which is a little bit cringe if you ask me, but we'll have to allow it. As you can see, the Frostworm is annihilating these great swords. They are terrified and they are taking massive hits. The Empire Captain is also taking massive hits on the Skinwolves. They have a bunch of damage. It doesn't say super armor piercing, but I'm pretty sure they have a nice chunk of armor piercing, and of course anti-large, and he's on a mount, so he's definitely feeling the burn from there. Over on the left side, we have this massive melee going on between a bunch of units. We've got Marauders, great weapons, we've got Famir, warriors, we've got War Mammoths. It's all happening in the middle here, and it's a fantastic melee, and we are definitely coming out on top purely because we have so much damage and so much mass on the front lines. It's really hard for almost any faction to stop you. If there was going to be one to stop you, it'd probably be the Dwarves, just because their front lines are just so damn heavy. There we go, finally making contact with the Hellstorms, and that'll be the last volleys that they ever put out. Luminac of Heish coming in, looks to make a hit, but didn't really do too much damage, so I'm not too worried about it. And as it always happens, folks, we're pretty much just cleaning up now. The enemy General of the Empire has retreated momentarily, but we'll be back in a second, so as soon as he charges back in, I'll swarm these 3 units on him, and he will fall very, very quickly indeed. My unit of Marauder Great Weapons Champions has come back. Unfortunately, 1 unit has shattered, but that is not the end of the world whatsoever. It's still alive. It will live to fight another day. So I'm pretty happy with that. The Skinwolves are now running rampant in the enemy backlines. There's not really much they can do about this. Of course, not the best at taking out retreating units, especially when you compare it to units such as Warhounds. But goddamn, they do a brilliant job at taking out ranged infantry. It's really quite a spectacle to behold. Now, we do have the one War Mammoth kind of stood around getting shot in the ass by the handguns, but he's just noticed and is now making a charge onto them. The Frostworm now attacking the Luminac of Heish, as you can see, is doing a fantastic bloody damage there. 450 armor piercing, magical, and frostbite imbued attacks. So yes, he's going to go down very, very quickly. And with that, we have army losses. And do we have the Caribou Greyswords? I don't believe we actually do this battle, which is a rare treat indeed for these. So yes, I think things I could have done better. It's probably just microing the monsters on the whole. Like as I saw, that Warmouth stood around. We had a unit of Marauders stood around. Probably could have microed them a little bit better. Got the Skinwolves in a little bit earlier as well. They took a very, very wide path. And while it did keep them safe, I could have probably made a little bit of a tighter path, had the same result, and got them in a minute or so earlier to take out the enemy range, and we could have probably reduced the casualties there. But nevertheless, very happy with this army's performance. Very happy with my performance. Let me know in the comments, of course. If it's terrible, I'm sure you will. Don't need me to tell you that. Now let's get into the stats. First of all, the Marauder Chieftain. He was pretty much exclusively fighting the General of the Empire, so his damage value, how we say it in the industry, dick all. Yeah, he got no kills, not much damage value. He would have been much better spent on the front lines, but because their Lord was attacking me, I just thought I may as well try and focus him down as quickly as possible, because once you get rid of the enemy Lord, the entire army has a massive leadership debuff, and it can sometimes trigger an army losses or at least severe chain route of a bunch of units that are already relatively low leadership. So I didn't think it was too bad, but nevertheless, it did his job. And if there was more infantry to take out, he could have done it, but the front lines managed just well without him. The Famir Balefiend of Fire, of course, getting a ton of damage value on cheaper units. So not really a ton of damage value, but a lot of damage on cheaper units. Took out a bunch of ranged units, and of course was fighting the enemy General of the Empire alongside the Lord, so was helping out much. Was helping out a lot there with his fantastic damage on the front lines, as well as his excellent spell support. Onto the front lines now, we have 1100 there, 900 there, 900 there, 158 there. Wow, what the hell were they fighting? 844 and the 781. Of course, the front lines, like in most of the army builds, are kind of just there to get in the way and make room for the rest of your army. But as you can see, these guys did about the damage value of an enemy greatswords or themselves. So they basically paid for themselves, which is very rare for infantry in most of my army compositions. So I'm very, very pleased with these guys. Of course, if you want a tougher front line, you could get rid of the great weapons, get a bit of defense. But I just prefer to go for the great weapons and pressure down the enemy as much as possible. This is a very aggressive army composition. You want to be attacking them constantly, taking out any new units that they throw at you, shredding them as quickly as possible, moving on to the next one to try and trigger army losses as quickly as possible, and it did just that. Speaking of which, the Armoured Skin Wolves, 1500 damage value, 900 there, 400 there, and 509. I'm guessing this is the one that was fighting the Empire Captain. Yeah, he for some reason charged into them on a mount when they have anti-large damage and a ton of armor and outnumber him severely. I don't really know what the AI's plan was there, but it was not good. I must say that it definitely was not good. The Armoured Skin Wolves did a fantastic job. As I said, could have got them around to flank a little bit earlier, help out dismantling those back lines. Once they got there wasn't really much to dismantle, but they did an excellent job of it nonetheless and stopped those Hellstorms from firing. And they only got 24 and 23 kills each, which, you know, for Hellstorms is extremely low. So I'm very, very pleased with that. And again, if the enemy had a bunch more ranged or there were 2 armies, you could easily take out 2 armies worth of ranged units with these guys as long as you kept the front lines busy. Moving on to the Famir great weapons now, we have 1000 damage value, 565 with 0 kills. That was probably the unit that was assisting with taking out the General of Empire, so again, not too bothered about that. 561 and 2464. They were probably the ones that were fighting a lot of the cav, and look, they just barely took any damage whatsoever, and some of those demogryphs, in fact both of those demogryphs had halberds, so they also had anti-large damage. Famir warriors are outstanding. If you really wanted to, you could run these as your front line. I probably wouldn't recommend doing that because the front lines do really offer quite a meat shield for the rest of your army. But honestly, the damage they do, the armor they have, their melee stats, everything about them is fantastic. They did a great job here. Very, very pleased with that. 2 Frostworms, 1600 damage value and 1000 damage value, 88 kills and 79. They fired off, I didn't really show it very well, a lot of breath abilities into big clumps, so we're taking out lots of infantry, racking up tons of kills. And of course, they can be anywhere on the battlefield. And I actually used the one on the right hand side of the battlefield was to pin down enemy units so that my Skin Wolves remain safe. Because a Frostworm can take on a unit of greatswords and not feel the burn too much. Of course, it can take a bit of damage, but nothing crazy. But the Skin Wolves, if they got pinned down by greatswords, they would have fallen very, very quickly. So I'm more than happy to send in a dragon to pin down enemy units or to send it into the backline to take out Lunax of Heish and at least stall the artillery, just like we did. And finally, last but not least, we have 1357 and 869. Very nice for the 2 War Mammoths. Of course, they could have gotten even deeper into those clumps. If the enemy had even more front lines, they would get even more value. But as it stands, we managed to roll them pretty quickly. So, not the most damage value, but War Mammoths, you cannot go wrong. Of course, if you're boring, you can go with 19 of them, put a Marauder Chieftain on one for around 20, and have yourself a very nice day. But that's boring, and I don't really like doing that. I quite like having varied army compositions. It just makes it feel a lot more real, and it's also a lot more engaging than, what shall I recruit? Click Mammoth 19 times? Yes, I think I will. There we go. I believe that wraps up everything that you need to know about how to build army compositions for Norsca. Let me know if you like this video by leaving it a like, and if you want to see more content like this, then definitely be sure to consider subscribing because I'm uploading videos every single week. And of course, when we get to Warhammer 3, videos will be coming thick and fast for that, so definitely subscribe and be very excited. Leave a comment down below, tell me what you think of my compositions. I'm always happy to hear suggestions and make improvements. That's how we all learn this wonderful game. Of course, be sure to check out COLONELDAMNEDERS store. I'm going to say this every video until they're gone, but the Christmas sweats, they're on sale right now until the end of the year. And also, if you use code FESTAG2021 at checkout, you get 10% off everything on the entire store, but only until the end of the year, so definitely be sure to make the most of that while you can. Also, if you'd like to support the channel in an even more direct way, you can consider becoming a supporter by being a member on YouTube, a patron on Patreon, or a subscriber on Twitch. Doing so gets you all sorts of fun goodies like shoutouts such as ItchBoyLC and Henry Tucker for their support at the Unclean Ones tier. Massive thank you to all supporters, thank you to everyone for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.